Good afternoon, everyone. We're just giving it a second as everyone is joining us from the waiting room before we get started. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this JTED Notice of Funding opportunity, preparing the budget. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be your moderator and technical support for this session. So if you experience any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to me via the chat and I will support you in those efforts of fixing any technical difficulties you might experience during this session. Just a couple of housekeeping reminders before we get started with our presenters for this technical assistance session. As a reminder, all participants on this call do have the capability to unmute yourselves, but we ask that you refrain from doing that until the end of the session. If you have questions as the session proceeds, please post those in the chat and we will address them at the end. And you can also feel free to unmute yourselves at the end during our live Q&A portion of the session. I also wanted to remind everyone that this is being recorded and today's recording will be up on Illinois WorkNet on the Notice of Funding Opportunity website that's on your screen right now that we're showing. And that will be up within about 48 hours to allow for just editing time. And then in an effort to be as accessible as possible, this session is offering closed captioning. It's not as accurate as we would love it to be, so the recording will be completely accurate closed captioning. So make sure you check that out if you need that capability. And then another just reminder, if you do experience faulty internet connection or would prefer to call in today, please do so by using the phone number in your original registration email that was sent to you via Zoom. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our main presenter today, Josh Coons.
Thank you, Kirsten. So hello, everyone. My name is Josh Coons. I'm a grant manager with the Office of Employment and Training. I'm also the fiscal liaison, and those two positions tied together have me here with you today going over the budget for the Job Training Economic Development Notice of Funding. And I do see some familiar names in the meeting, so I apologize if some of this is redundant when it comes to the budget and some of the formula grants that we have as well. So to start off here, if you go through the Illinois WorkNet website, you'll obviously see the JTED Notice of Funding tab that I have up here. And on the far right-hand side is where all the material is for the NOFO. And the one that we'll be going over today is the JTED Uniform Budget. So if you click that link, it actually downloads for you. And this is what you'll see. Give me 1 second. All right, so if you download it, this is what you'll see, and it looks extremely excessive with all the tabs and everything, but hopefully after today, I'm able to clear up some of that for you all. So we'll dive right in here. So the first tab that you're going to see is the general instructions. And my advice to you would be to print this tab. That way, as you're going through the other tabs, you're able to refer back to it. And this goes over basic parts of this uniform budget, that being Section A, Section B, and Section C. So there's 3 parts to this budget. Next, we'll go to the Section A tab. So in this tab, essentially the only thing that you need to complete is the light blue section. So for example, and I'm going to make up one, we're going to go with Youth Job Center. All right, so, and when you fill that name in there, this Excel sheet is programmed to complete that in every other tab. So for organization name on this tab, it copied over. You'll put your DUNS number, the CSFA and the CSFA description are completed for you, and the fiscal year is completed as well. So this number, you won't have to worry about at this time. So whenever you do complete the budget, feel free to leave it blank. Other than that, the only portion on this tab that you'll fill out is the indirect cost rate. However, you would not have to do that information until the end, until you have that number. And then this highlighted blue actually is the total overall grant amount that you would be submitting for, and that would be completed as well. So we're actually going to skip the indirect worksheet and save that to the end. Once the numbers actually start to make sense and go into here, I'll be able to explain that better. So we'll start off with your indirect cost information. So right now you'd have 5 options that you're able to select, and we'll go through them here. So option 1 is going to be that you have a negotiated indirect cost rate agreement with a federal entity. And if you do have that, then you would fill out this portion of the template right here. And that one also goes for 2A, which is saying our organization currently has a NICRA with the state of Illinois. So if you have a NICRA with the federal government or another agency with the state, then those can carry over to this grant opportunity as well. Then there's option 2B, which is stating that you do not have a negotiated indirect cost rate, but when you were notified if you were being granted this award opportunity, then no later than 3 months after the effective date, you would submit your information to the indirect cost unit. Then there's option 3, which is your organization has never received a negotiated indirect cost rate from federal or state government, and you're choosing to select 10% of modified total direct costs, which is the de minimis. And that's the option we're actually going to be using today. That's the one that we tend to see more often. And then we also happen to see option 5 most of the time as well, with a no reimbursement of indirect costs. So for this one, we're going to select the 10% modified total direct costs. So for that, in the indirect worksheet, I would put my 10% that I'm choosing to use for indirect costs, as well as for your rate on section A as 10%. And you'll notice that an error message pops up, but you don't have to worry about that yet, because once you complete this box, that'll satisfy. All right, so then we're going to section B of the budget template. So here, this is where information will be completed, where if you were leveraging funds or had matching funds from another entity, this is where they would go. We don't see this a lot, so I won't go entirely into detail over this portion. However, I can show you in the tabs where you would put this information if you choose to do so. All right, the next tab we have is the certification tab. So really this part would only be necessary if you are granted the award. When they asked you to submit your final budget, you would complete this portion. So we'd have you input your information, you would print this page and landscape, and then sign it and submit it with your budget. All right, so now we're going into the main portion of this budget template. So these are the meat and potatoes essentially of the budget template, and the part that most people find to be more complicated. So give me 1 second while I pull up another document. All right. So what I'm going to do essentially is I'm going to go through as if I was completing this document. Give me 1 second here. Okay. All right. So first off, the one thing I'd like to point out is that you'll notice there's 2 portions of this, of each section of the different portions of the budget. So you'll notice there's a state adult total and a state youth total. So what you would do here is if you have employees that would be going under the adult budget line, you're going to complete one of these sections. Same thing goes for the youth. So if you have someone that will be considered a youth counselor or something along those lines, they would go in your youth total. And then down here, you'll see that the non-state. So that's what I was referring to. If you have funds that are going to be matched for a program, or any other funds besides this NOFO, that's where these lines would go. Like I said, we don't see that very often, so I won't necessarily worry about it for this training. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start. And essentially, I'm going to create employees that would be considered, salaries and wages under the adult personnel. All right, so you'll notice that I put salary of Joe Brown is $85,000 with 10% of his time allocated to this grant, and then the length of time of 1. So that gives us $8,500 for the personnel cost. I will do the same for a couple other ones just so I can show you guys what all needs to go in there. So as of right now, the state adult total is 16,000 and your state total, so for the entire grant right now, is 16,000 as well. We will create one more here. All right, so right now I have 3 employees that would go under the adult section of the grant. And I'm going to move on to our youth employees. And I'll do one last one here. All right, so now that we have all the salaries and wages completed, I'm going to show you that if you go back to the Section A tab, you'll notice that the total expenditures for those personnel has carried over to this sheet. So for $57,500, and if you go to your state total, so that's combining your adult personnel and your youth personnel, that number matches. And essentially, we will do the same thing for our fringe benefits. So those same employees that were on the other tabs would also be carried over to here as your adult employees. All right, so you'll notice that the state total for fringe benefits is 26,100, and if you refer back to your Section A, that's going to go in there. So that'll be consistent throughout the worksheet as you complete the personnel tabs all the way through your indirect costs. That information will transfer over. All right, so I'm just going to keep on going along here. So now we are moving to travel budget line. And for this one, I just created a training class that is occurring in Springfield, and you're reimbursing the members for their mileage. And then if you'll notice at the top, obviously sometimes you're not going to know where a trip or where a course or training will be held. So you do have the option of putting location to be determined on there. So that's what I did for this example. So I've input two different purpose of travels for a total of 1,800. And one thing I will note, I'm purposely going to leave the equipment tab blank just to show you that if you don't put anything on the equipment tab, nothing will transfer over to your section A, your budget summary. So we'll go ahead and leave that one blank. All right, and then we will make up some supplies that you may need. And we will do the same for your youth funding. And just to explain to you guys, so obviously this NOFO has the opportunity for youth funding and adult funding. And I've spoken with one of the program managers, and she doesn't anticipate that you would have to go in for youth and adult funding. You have the opportunity to choose either or have funding for adult and youth. That's totally up to you. But it would be under the same grant, from my understanding. And one thing I did leave off, I did not. All right. Went back to the travel tab, and essentially I'm just filling in information for the youth portion of it. All right. So we have our supplies for our adult and our youth. And also just to point out, if you do need more rows inserted into the budget template, this template is locked. So there's not much that you'll be able to input. So if you have to insert additional rows, you can contact myself, and I can take care of that for you. All right, so now we're going to move on to our contractual services. So I have an expense here. Tutorial services for the amount of 2,500. And I'm also going to leave the consultant services and expenses blank, just to show you that you might not necessarily have funding allocated to each budget line. That's totally up to you. And for occupancy, we will put a rent expense in 1,200. We will do the same thing for youth. R&D will be left blank as well for this one. We'll put phones in for telecommunications. And one thing that I have forgot to clarify, that is at the bottom of each of these worksheets, there's actually a narrative. And that is where you have your chance to explain to us essentially why that you believe that this amount will be needs to be budgeted for this. So the more information you put in these tabs in the narrative helps us. That way we don't have to contact you to clarify what exactly that expense is. So it's very important that you input as much information as possible in there. That way we are able to understand exactly what you're needing. Okay, so moving along here to training and education. And then your direct administrative costs. So on here, I have created 2 more employees that will be doing administrative work, as well as an accountant. All right, and then for the budget line item of other miscellaneous costs, I created a few costs. And I will not put anything for the youth on this one, just to show you that you can have either or. All right, so this is where a lot of the budget will come from, is your direct training, obviously. So essentially what you'd have to go through or do is go through these options here for your adult and your youth, and determine how much in each category that you would need. So I did input some occupational skills training for adult as well as supportive services. And then we'll move over to work-based training. I apologize that I have to type all these in, unfortunately. And we'll do the same for your youth funding if you are using both, or I'm just gonna input some for work experience / internships. We'll go ahead and go to barrier reduction. All right, so and lastly is your indirect cost worksheet, or excuse me, your indirect cost tab. So I'm not going to fill this in yet. This would be the perfect time that you go back to your indirect worksheet. And you'll notice that all the information from those tabs that we were completing are actually being filled in here. So that's nothing that you would have to do. And you'll notice there's blanks where or areas that I did not input any information in there. So what you'd have to do is, so like I said, we're using the 10% of modified total direct costs, or de minimis. And luckily over here in column I, there's notes that will explain to you exactly which sections of the funding that you're requesting can be included in your direct cost base and which cannot. So for example, right here is where you'd put in the exclusion. So in this one, it says included in the direct cost base. That means that no amount of the 29,000 can be input as an exclusion for your direct cost base. So really, a lot of those are going to say that. However, when you go down here to equipment, you'll notice that there is nothing, it says excluded from your indirect cost base. So if you were to have equipment in here, it would have to be excluded from your direct cost base. And the same for your occupancy. So for example, right here, I will input 7,200 because it says that rent is has to be excluded from your cost base. And then your direct administrative costs also have to be excluded. And one thing I'd like to point out that you will notice that there are notes there's a column that where the notes showing. And if you scroll down further here, you'll notice that each of those, there's two notes here that go along with those asterisks. So we'll continue on here. So this is another one where it has to be excluded. So we'll input that, as well as your barrier reduction. All right, so in the end, once you've completed all of that, this is where you'll see that you'll have an adult program direct cost base and your youth program direct cost base. And that is where that is the information you'll use to complete your direct cost base tab. So if you go all the way back to indirect costs, you'll input that information. You're doing 10%. And then your youth was 129,825, 10% as well. So if you go back to your indirect worksheet, all right, so if you go back to your worksheet, I might have made a mistake here. Give me 1 second. Oh, there it is. See if I got it right. 425. 1 second. Okay, so you'll know that you've done it correctly if you go to check your accuracy and it equals 0. However, you can be within $1. So right now it's showing a negative $1, which would mean that you satisfy that requirement. So then once you have this amount, you'll see that it sums to $374,250. So you'll go back to this tab, and that's when you'll input your base for indirect costs. So $374,250. And you'll notice that that error message is gone. If I were to input a 1 there, and that is incorrect, it'll say your base must match 17 in section C, which is this indirect cost tab. And it's saying that it does not match the sum of these two. So I'll go ahead and fix that. All right, so I believe that this last tab here is actually just a summary of the expenses. It's similar to Section A, however, it breaks it down for you, and as well as your non-state total. So it's all in one of your Section A and your Section B. And then the last tab is agency approval. You would not have to worry about this tab. That tab's for OET's use. All right. So Kirsten, I don't know if you want to take questions on the budget before we move over to sustainability, or if how you'd prefer to do it.
That's completely up to you.
Okay. I say probably be best if we took questions now on the budget, and then I can move over to sustainability, which won't take very long.
Okay. So can you see the chat, or do you need me to help facilitate, Josh?
Yes, I can see this chat here. Seems to be quite a few messages. Oh, it looks like there was a 0 being input.
So we have a question from Crystal. It says, if we're in the process of hiring new staff and we want them to be reflected in the budget, do we just state new hire?
That is correct. So you can put new hire, and then typically you could put new hire and then TBD, or so to be decided, or something along those lines. That's pretty common. Obviously, if you're just starting up with this, then yeah, that's no problem at all.
Okay. And then Teresa says, I thought we were no longer putting individual names in the budget worksheets.
I have not heard that. I know that for the formula budgets, which are that I'm the grant manager for, that we still do allow specific names.
Okay, great. And then can you add additional rows to the spreadsheet?
Okay, and that one I did kind of answer. So you are able to add rows. So if you'll notice that I was able to insert rows. However, it doesn't carry the formula down. So a grantee would not be able to do it just because it's locked by accounting. So you'd have to contact me to be able to insert additional rows into that category.
Okay, great. The budget lines have adult and youth, but the summary budget page combines the amounts by each line. If we include both adult and youth, do we have to track them separately or a total for this grant?
So from my understanding, Debbie, the expenditure codes that you're seeing on Section A are what you're going to see when you input. So they're the budget placeholders essentially. And when you go to report costs, you're going to report them on, so 1,000, for example, would be for personnel. And then you're going to have an adult line, which is 1,001, and a youth line, which is 1,002. And that should be throughout the entire budget. So it'll be tracked as it, or your budget placeholder will say 57,500, but you'll report costs to the specific adult or youth line.
Okay, and then Leslie Kane had asked for you to explain the structure of the cost for the training. Is it per student, per session, or just total sessions and costs?
So I believe, is Tammy on the line? Let me see if.
Tammy Stone.
Yeah.
I'm on. I was trying to find my unmute button. Sorry. Okay, now you were talking about average cost.
So they're essentially asking for the budget. Would you prefer that it's per student per session, or just your total overall sessions for like training costs?
Training costs, you would probably just want to do it for the overall session.
Okay, I thought so. I didn't want to step on.
No, you don't. We don't want to break it down per student. So I mean, you're going to provide the detail if we anticipate, we're going to serve, if your enrollment's going to be, 20 people and they're all going to be in this particular class and the cost per is this. It needs to have that kind of detail in it, but it could all be like on one line item, and you can also include that in the narrative.
Right. Perfect. And then I see one more additional question from Ronald. Is this reimbursement grant or costs covered up front? So this is a reimbursement grant. So essentially, if you were awarded, you would have access to our accounting system through the portal or through the website, which is GRS or EPC. And you would report your costs in there and then request cash on a weekly basis to cover those costs. Are there any other questions? Okay. So I'll actually, on the slideshow that I have next, I have my contact information, which has my work cell and my email. So if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me. When it comes to this actual template, I don't know as much about the program side of the JTED NOFO. I'm more of the budget guru, we'll say. How long does it take to get a reimbursement once submitted? So that depends. So typically, I believe, going off of my experience from the formula grantees that I have, if they submit a cash request 1 week, typically the next week it is direct deposited into their account from the comptroller's office. And that's barring no setbacks, for example, such as fee locks or if there's any issue or questions that the fiscal liaison has that's approving the cash request. But typically, I would say within a week, you're seeing the funds that you requested. All right. So next, we're going to go into the sustainability portion, which should not take very long at all here. All right, so just what we'll be talking about is why sustainability planning, what needs to be included or what needs included in a good sustainability plan. Then an example. Like I said, this shouldn't be terribly painful. There's only 8 slides, I believe, in total. So sustainability planning. So essentially you're planning so the planning should not be saved for the end of the grant funding period or sustainability planning. So what would be ideal is if you're planning over the entire time life of the grant, essentially it's important to establish whether the entire program is going to be sustained or if just select components are going to become sustained. So part of the sustainability planning, it identifies the key components of a program that will continue over time. And then funds received as part of this grant are intended to be seed pilots rather than to fund existing programs. So for example, it is expected that grantees establish a relationship with like LWIB and their staff that ensures successful pilots and components of the pilot integrate. That way it can, go into a larger service delivery model, essentially. All right, so we'll go over an example. So part of the grant component would be, so for example, LBX has identified manufacturing training as a priority in the region or local plan. So the grant will provide training for manufacturing for adult. So the sustained component would be actually meeting with that local workforce innovation area before the grant is over to review the current project and ensuring that the training services that are offered are still applicable or are still in need for that area. And then, so business engagement partnerships. So the grant component, essentially businesses are suited to ensure current content programs and career that are high in demand, high skill level at a regional or state level. And so that can be clearly defined for the roles and responsibilities or the memorandum of understanding with the regional and cross-sector partnerships. So, and the sustained component of that would be having multiple check-ins, just continuing to determine which jobs are in high demand. And so in the last portion here, this is my information. So if you ever need to get a hold of me when it comes to the JTED budget template, feel free to reach out. If I don't have an answer, then I should be able to get an answer for you. And let me see if there's any additional questions here. Okay, so Claire asked for my contact information, which should be on your screen now, Claire. Do we have any other questions?
I don't believe so, no, but at this time, if you'd like to unmute yourselves, you can feel free to do so. I also wanted to just jump in with some closing remarks, just reminding everyone that this session was recorded and it will be up on the Notice of Funding website. Probably by the end of the day today, I'll be able to get it up there for everyone. And you can check out all of the past recordings from the sessions this week on that Notice of Funding website, and also register for the sessions that will be held next week as well. Do you have any closing remarks, Josh?
The only thing I have to say is that if you guys have any problems at all with the budget template, feel free to reach out to me. I can see how it can be overwhelming with all these tabs, but I'm absolutely able to walk you through it to the best of my ability. And I think that's all I have. Tammy, did you have anything that you'd like to add, or anything that I missed that you'd like to clarify?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. And I did put in the snap or the chat section, because we're talking about the difference between youth and adult. If you're planning to do a youth and adult program, we're just having one grant, one budget. The reason we have it separated like this is in the grant agreement, it'll just have the high level, so it'll just have your personnel, fringe, training. But when you go to report the cost in GRS, if you're doing both youth and adult, you'll have to break that out when you're reporting costs, and then that'll roll up into the total columns. And the reason for doing this is to provide flexibility for you guys, because we don't want to have to modify the budget every time you're moving money between, like, say, youth and adult. We want to provide maximum flexibility without having to do a lot of modifications. So that was the intent behind this. And we do need to track expenditures for youth and adult. So this seemed to be the best way of, trying to get what we need without a lot of difficulty or effort when it comes to having to modify. That's pretty much all I got. Josh, I think you did a great job.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I will close this out.
Awesome. Thank you, Kirsten.